She signed the marriage register with a steady hand, though her heart was anything but. The county clerk watched from behind his spectacles without expression, and Temperance Larkin fixed her eyes on the ink drying on the page, not on the broad-shouldered stranger standing 3 feet to her left. Ely Tennant smelled of hay and saddle leather, and she'd known him all of 4 days. 4 days since the letter arrived at the boarding house in Callaway, written in a neighbor's cramped hand on behalf of a man who needed a wife to satisfy a land deeds provision by the 1st of October. 4 days since she'd answered it, because the county had given her until that same date to prove she could house and keep her younger brother and sister, or surrender them to the Territorial Children's Home. She'd done the arithmetic. The answer was the man now scrawling his own name below hers. They rode back to Fox Hollow in the borrowed wagon, her 2 siblings wedged between them on the seat, 14-year-old Delia with her chin set against the world, and 9-year-old Martin clutching a sack that held everything he owned. Ely said nothing past directions at the 2 forks. Temperance said nothing either. The late September air carried a bite that felt prophetic. The ranch house was larger than she'd feared and cleaner than she'd hoped. Someone had swept the main room. Someone, she realized with a small shock it must have been Ely himself, had put fresh-cut sage in a jar on the window ledge. She didn't know what to make of that detail, so she filed it away and said nothing. "Delia and Martin can take the room at the end of the hall," she said, the first full sentence she'd spoken to him since the ceremony. "I figured." He carried in her trunk without being asked. "The hired man, Hector, bunks in the barn. He's been here 6 years. He's good people." "Then I'll take his word for it." Ellie looked at her then, directly, for the first time all day. He had grey eyes, the colour of creek water in January, and they weren't unkind. "I know this arrangement isn't what either of us would have chosen." "No," she agreed, "it isn't. I'll honour my end. The children are under this roof as long as you and I both stand by the terms." She met his eyes, "And I'll honour mine." That was the whole of it, and somehow it was enough to begin. The first week was a study in careful choreography. Temperance learned the kitchen's moods. The stove ran hot on the left side. The pantry shelves were labelled in a hand she didn't recognize, likely his late mother's. She cooked 3 meals a day and asked no questions about the grief that clung to the corners of the house. Delia, suspicious of everything, washed dishes with a ferocity that broke 2 cups before the week was out. Martin, bless him, followed Hector to the barn every morning before breakfast and came back with chaff in his hair and a light in his eyes that Temperance hadn't seen since their parents' wagon went over the bridge in June. Ely worked from before sunup until well past dark. She left his supper covered on the stove when he was late, and he always ate it, and he always left the plate clean and the pan back on the hook. She told herself that was enough. What she hadn't let herself examine closely was how much she noticed the small things he did without comment. The mended step at the back porch, seen to before she'd said a word about it. The way he asked Martin at supper what he'd learned from Hector that day, and listened to the boy's whole stumbling answer with genuine interest. The 2 extra blankets he put on the hallway shelf the morning the first cold front swept down from the north, without explanation and without need of one. She was not accustomed to being considered. It startled her every time. It was his neighbour, Floyd Garrett, who introduced the first open complication. Garrett arrived on the 3rd Thursday with 2 men at his back, and a look on his face that Temperance distrusted on sight, too smooth, too settled in itself. He didn't bother tipping his hat to her. "Tenant," he called out, "county recorder's been asking questions about that deed of yours. Word is your father's note to the bank has a rider on it that says the land reverts if there's no wife of record on the property by October 1st. He smiled at Eli's silence. "Suppose you've taken care of that." "Suppose I have," Ely said, his voice flat. "Well," Garrett's gaze moved to Temperance with the slow deliberation of a man appraising livestock. "I'll want to see the register myself then, if you've no objection." "I've plenty of objection," she said before Ely could answer. Garrett blinked. He wasn't used to being cut off by women in calico. "The register," she continued, keeping her voice mild, "is a public record at the county courthouse. You're welcome to ride to Callaway and look at it yourself, Mr. Garrett. I believe they're open 6 days a week." Silence. Then Garrett laughed, one short bark, and looked at Ely with something between irritation and grudging surprise. "She's got a mouth on her." "She's right," Ely said simply. Garrett left, but the shape of his intention stayed behind him like smoke. Over supper that evening, with Delia and Martin excused to the back porch, Ely told her the rest of it. Garrett had been angling for Fox Hollow for 3 years. He owned the 2 parcels on either side and wanted the water rights the tenant land controlled. The bank note with the deed's provision was something Garrett himself had quietly arranged through a man on the bank's board he had in his pocket. The marriage had been Eli's only legal counter. "So you were trapped," she said. "I was cornered." He drew a slow breath. "I'm sorry it dragged you into my corner." She thought about that. "I had my own corner. We just happened to be sharing one now." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the shadow where one might live. The second complication came from inside the house, and it wore the face of her sister. Delia had been polite to Ely in the manner of someone who has decided politeness is more weaponizable than rudeness. She performed her chores, answered when spoken to, and made it very clear by every inflection of her 14-year-old spine that she was watching. She was watching to see if Ely Tennant would prove to be the kind of man who changed once the paperwork was signed. Temperance knew why and couldn't argue with the vigilance. Their father had been a gentle man and they'd still been left with nothing. The world had not been kind to Larkin women. In the second week, Delia tested him directly, in the way that teenagers do when they've decided to stop waiting for a reveal and simply force one. She came to supper with a chip on her shoulder the size of a cedar rail and dropped it on the table by telling him, point blank, that she'd heard in town that Ely Tennant's first hired hand had quit because Eli had a temper. The kitchen went still. Temperance set down her fork. Ely considered the accusation with the unhurried attention he gave most things. "That's partly true," he said at last. "His name was Aldridge, and I lost my temper with him twice. The second time I said things I shouldn't have, and I told him so the next morning, and he stayed on another 4 months before leaving to go back to his mother's in Kansas. We parted square." He looked at Delia steadily. "I don't have a short fuse by nature. That was a hard spring. But I don't use that as an excuse." Delia held his gaze for a long moment. Then she picked up her fork. "All right," she said. It wasn't absolution, but it was the beginning of something. The afternoon that changed the larger picture was a Tuesday in mid-October. Martin had climbed the old cottonwood by the creek, the one Hector had told him twice not to climb, and the branch he'd trusted gave way. Temperance heard the crack from the kitchen. She was out the door before the sound finished. Martin was on the ground below the tree, not moving, and for one terrible moment the world seemed to stop completely. Then Ely was there, running from the far pasture, and he reached the boy 2 steps before she did. His hands moved over Martin with the practiced economy of a man who had handled animals in pain, checking with a gentleness that was a revelation. "Nothing broken," he said very quietly. "Wine knocked out. He needs a minute, that's all." She knelt in the dirt beside her brother and took his hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She was shaking and she couldn't stop it. Ely did not tell her to get up. He stayed crouched on the boy's other side until Martin coughed back to life and looked around with wide, mortified eyes. Then Ely helped him to his feet and walked him slowly toward the house with one hand steady at the small of his back, and never once mentioned the times he'd been told not to climb that tree. Delia had seen it from the porch. She didn't say anything that afternoon, but at supper she refilled Eli's coffee cup without being asked, and Temperance watched the gesture and felt something loosen in her chest, that she hadn't known she was holding tight. October deepened. Fox Hollow settled into a rhythm that surprised her by feeling like something other than an arrangement. She learned that Ely read at night by the window, cattle journals, and twice a worn volume of poetry she didn't ask about. She learned that he whistled tunelessly when he was working alone and went quiet when he was thinking hard, and that he had a way of listening to her that wasn't common, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually listening, as though what she said mattered enough to deserve his full attention. She wasn't used to it. It kept catching her off guard in small, unguarded moments. She told him one evening about their parents, the river crossing in the flood, the way Martin had been the one to pull Delia clear, while she'd gone back for the box with their mother's letters. He didn't offer comfort. He just said, "You raised them well," and she had to look away, because no one had said that to her before, not once, and it went straight through her. She answered him honestly, "I didn't know what I was doing. I still don't, half the time. I just couldn't let them be split up and sent to strangers." "That's not half knowing," he said. "That's the whole thing." In return, one morning over the breakfast dishes, he told her about his father, the debt that shouldn't have been possible, the man at the bank who'd let Garrett engineer it, the feeling of watching the thing his father built begin to slide from his hands. "My father broke his back on this land," he said, "not in any romantic way. Literally. A horse rolled on him in '87. He farmed and ran cattle with one arm he couldn't raise above his shoulder for the last 12 years of his life." He paused. "I'm not letting someone take what he built because of a paper trick." She understood him then, not completely. A person was never fully known in 6 weeks, but enough. Garrett's third move came in November, and it was the kind that required something other than a cool reply. He brought the bank man himself, a narrow-faced lawyer named Pruitt, and they arrived on a Monday with papers claiming the deed's wife provision had not been properly satisfied, on the grounds that there was no record of the couple having lived as man and wife, that the marriage was, in Pruitt's careful language, a matter of convenience rather than substance, and could therefore be voided by the original codicil. Temperance read the papers twice through. Her jaw tightened. "They're fishing," Ellie said. "They're fishing with a net," she said. "Where is that codicil?" He found it in the locked tin box in the bedroom closet. She read it twice, then a third time. Then she sat at the kitchen table and wrote, by hand, a letter to a man named Jerome Ash, an attorney in Callaway she'd once done copying work for, outlining exactly what Garrett and Pruitt had done and the specific language they were misreading. She sent Hector with it that same afternoon, and stayed up past midnight in the kitchen with a lamp and the papers spread before her, making notes in the margins of a foolscap sheet. Ely found her there at midnight when he came in from checking on a labouring heifer. He set a cup of coffee beside her without a word, looked at the spread of papers, and said only, "Tell me what you need from me." "Your signature on a counter-statement," she said, "and your presence Thursday." "Don," he said, "and to bed." Jerome Ash came on Thursday with his leather satchel and the unhurried manner of a man who'd won most of his arguments before they started. The meeting at the Fox Hollow kitchen table was not a short one. Garrett was there, and so was Pruitt, and Temperance sat at that table and laid out every piece of what she'd read and what she'd understood. And when Garrett tried to redirect to Ely, she spoke first every time, because she had the language and she knew it, and she was not going to be spoken around at her own kitchen table. By the end of the afternoon, Garrett's claim was in pieces. The deed's provision required only a legal wife of record living on the property. It said nothing about the nature of the union. Pruitt had invented the codicil interpretation from whole cloth, and Jerome pointed that out in the precise, unhurried way of a man who'd been doing this for 30 years. Garrett's face moved through several colors before settling on a kind of grey resignation. He left with nothing. He didn't speak to Temperance on his way out, which suited her. Jerome Ashe stood at the door afterward and shook her hand. "Good reading," he said. "I had good material," she said, "and meant the codicil." But it was Eli's face she looked at when Jerome's buggy cleared the gate, that grey January Creek gaze steady on her, something in it she hadn't seen before, something that looked almost like wonder. "You dismantled him," he said. "We did," she said. "I handed you a deed and you went to war with it." She felt the warmth rise in her face and didn't apologize for it. "I'm not accustomed to losing things." He was quiet a long moment. Then, "Temperance, I'd like to know what this is between us, if you're willing." She had thought she knew herself well, practical, clear-eyed, done with wanting things she couldn't count. But standing in the doorway of the house at Fox Hollow with her brother's jacket on the peg, and the smell of her sister's bread in the air, and this man watching her with that particular quality of stillness, she found that she wanted to know the answer too. "I think," she said slowly, "it might be something worth finding out." In the days that followed, something in the house changed by small degrees, the way a fire takes hold, not in a single moment but in a slow gathering of warmth. Eli began to leave the lamp burning when he knew she'd be up late with mending. She began to set 2 cups on the table at breakfast before he'd come in from the morning chores. They both pretended not to notice they were doing it. There was one evening that lodged itself in her chest and stayed. She'd found a photograph she hadn't seen before, tucked into the back of the kitchen drawer when she was searching for a pen, of a woman with Eli's eyes and a dark-haired boy of perhaps 7 at her knee. She'd set it on the table uncertain, and Eli had come in and stood very still when he saw it. "My mother," he said, "before my father's accident." She didn't ask anything, she just said, "She looks kind." She was. He picked up the photograph with care, looked at it a long moment, and then looked at her in a way that held everything he hadn't learned to say yet. "She would have liked you." Temperance set her pen down. Her throat was suddenly unreliable. She said only, "Thank you," and meant it more than any 2 words she'd spoken in months. The first frost of winter settled on Fox Hollow the following week, a thick white quiet that blanketed the pasture and hung crystals on the sage brush. Eli built up the fire early and stayed in that evening, and after Martin was in bed and Delia had retired to a room with her library book, Eli and Temperance sat at the table with cups of coffee going cold between their hands and talked for 2 hours about nothing that needed to be talked about and everything that did. They talked about the land and what she thought it needed and what he'd always wanted to try but never had the nerve for. They talked about Delia's stubbornness, which, Eli said with a near smile, she came by honestly, and about Martin's talent for falling out of things. They talked about what it meant to keep a promise and what it meant to be left behind. Somewhere in the second hour her hand was resting near his on the table, and then his fingers had closed over hers, warm and certain, and neither of them commented on it. It was close to midnight when she finally rose to say good night. He walked her to the hallway and paused at the door of her room. The lamp in the hall threw soft light across his face. She could see the lines of him, the weathering and the care, and the thing he hadn't yet said aloud. "I'm glad you answered my letter," he said. "I'm glad I had reason to," she said. He nodded once, slow and easy, and turned back toward the main room, and she stood in her doorway until his footsteps faded into the ordinary sounds of the house settling around them. On a Sunday morning in December, with snow falling soft outside the window, Martin came in from the barn and said without preamble, "Hector says you 2 are the best couple on this range." He deposited his boots by the door and wandered off to find breakfast, leaving the observation behind him like a dropped hat. Delia looked up from her book. She looked at Eli. She looked at Temperance. "He's not wrong," she said, and turned the page. Temperance didn't trust herself to speak. Eli reached over and, very quietly, refilled her coffee cup. She'd married him to keep her family together. He'd married her to keep what his father built. That was the truth of how it started, and she wouldn't dress it in prettier cloth than it deserved. But sitting in the house at Fox Hollow on a December morning with her brother's voice from the kitchen, and her sister's page turning in the stillness, and this man's warmth beside her, this man who listened when she spoke and fought beside her and carried her trunk without being asked and left clean dishes on the hook and had said to her once, quietly, that she'd raised them well, she understood that what they'd bargained for had grown into something neither of them had thought to name. She didn't need a name for it today. He reached for his coffee with his free hand, his other still holding hers, and she let herself settle into the quiet of it. Outside, the snow kept falling soft on Fox Hollow, covering the hard ground and the past alike, making everything clean and ready for what came next.